So if you go to the notes from last lecture, what we have is we were at this, basically we have this. We have the voltage at some time, which we're calling capital T, is equal to sort of what we've been calling our resting voltage, and then this very sort of ugly expression where we have to integrate this. So this is the integration variable is little t or lowercase t. So I have a lowercase t, I have a capital T, and then I have this Greek letter tau. And maybe I'll write this like 1 over t v sub L. And then I have my function I, which I'm not sure what it is. It can be some generic function for now. And then we're integrating with respect to t. So what we did in the notes is I said equals, you fill in, and then I gave you the final sort of answer. So what I'd like you to do now is we can help fill in these details for you. In order to do this, what you have to do is you have to distribute this ugly creature to both pieces. And there's a few ways you might sort of work on this. So let's check that out. So if I leave this piece alone, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to rewrite these terms in the integral slightly different. I'm first going to note that this is, so these guys right here, the 1 over tau VC sub L, that is a constant. This is 1 over a number times another number. So perhaps it might even be easier if you think of it like this. Let me put my plus sign here, and well, we'll go slower. So let me write it like this. So this is E. I'm going to write it as lowercase t over tau. And then this is times E to the negative capital T over tau. And then it's times 1 over tau V sub L. That's the first term. And then the next term inside the integral is, I'm going to write it slightly different. I'm going to write it as 1 over A C sub M. And then I'm going to write it as E to the T over tau, E to the negative T over tau. Oh. Now, I'm not saying you have to do it this way, but this might be the easier way for you to see what happens. And then what's left? What's left is the I of t. And then this is all dt. So again, I'm taking this initial exponential in the front, and I'm going to break it into two pieces. And the way I'm breaking it up is because in the one piece, there's no variable of integration. So what I mean by that is if you look at this piece right here, so this guy right here to this guy doesn't depend on t. And then over here, if I do the same thing, this guy and this guy, there's no t. So that means when I go to integrate, the best case, the thing that you might want to do is you might want to pull them out of the integral so things aren't so cumbersome looking. So before I do that, is there a question or a comment that maybe we have? Maybe. Okay. So what I'm going to do then is I'm going to rewrite this next on the next page. So once again, we have equal. So the very first thing is this V C sub L. And then, of course, we have our e to the negative capital T over tau. So again, if I go back, I'm not touching this at all because there's no integral associated with it. And in fact, it just depends on the variable capital T. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take this big integral that has two terms in it. I'm going to write it as two integrals to make it a little easier. So I'm going to pull all those constants out. I'm going to pull out the e to the negative T over tau. I'm going to pull out the 1 over tau B C sub L. And then what remains in that integral is the integral from 0 to capital T of just e to, I'm going to write it like this, 1 over tau T dt. So before I go anything, we have to make sure that we got that first integral correct. I pulled out the stuff that doesn't have lowercase t. And it looks like this. And then now I have to do a similar thing with my second integral. So my second integral had 1 over ACM and then this e to the negative t thing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to write this as 1 over a c sub n, excuse me. And then I have e to the negative capital T over tau. And then I have my integral left. Or did I forget something? I got that. Yeah. And then what's left in the integral is the integral 0 to t of just e to the 1 over tau t, and then of course I of t dt. All right, now what you'll find is what you'll find is that on the integral on the right, it's redundant. There's nothing we have to do. There's nothing we can do, to be honest, because I don't know what I is, so I can't integrate that. At least, I mean, I guess I could rewrite it, but it doesn't make much sense. So if I take my time here, what I want to tell you is that even though I told you to break this thing up before, if I come over here, I can, what I want to do is if I take this creature right here, I can just take it back inside the integral because there's nothing else I can do. And so I'm going to leave the 1 over a c sub n out here. And then when I take that exponential back in, I get what I started with originally, which is this. So I didn't touch the integral in the middle yet, because that's going to actually, I can work with that thing. Does anybody have a question? So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to think this, even though this integral right here looks sort of overwhelming because there's lots of t's and taus, it's really just an elementary integral. The variable is t. So if we do this, I'll do it in a different color to help illustrate. I'm not going to touch these guys yet. But when I integrate this, the integral is 1 over, remember, when you integrate the exponential function, so if I come down here, maybe put this in a different color. If I come down here, you'll remember that the integral of e to, say, the a t dt, this is just 1 over a, e to the at, you know, plus c, whatever. That's the integral of the elementary, you know, e to a number times t. All right, so if we remember that formula, 1 over tau becomes tau. And then this just becomes e to the 1 over tau t, evaluated from 0 to t. So what happens when I do this now? So let's erase this. When I plug in capital T, so of course the stuff in the purple is not changing. Oops. What happens here? What happens here is when I plug in capital T in for lowercase t, when I plug in capital T, I get tau e to the capital T over tau. Then when I plug in 0, I just get minus tau, because e to the 0 is 1. And I'll tell you what, guys, I really wish we were in a classroom right now, because this would be much more enjoyable if we were all working at this together. And I don't know how to do that on Zoom. Okay, so look what happens now. Now, when we just do algebra, things are going to go in our favor. If I now take this term and distribute it, who'd have thought all that crazy algebra we learned growing up was going to matter? Okay, so by the way, notice that the term on the right-hand side with the integral, that's exactly what I told you you should get, 1 over ACM times that integral. So this piece over here, this whole piece over here is what I told you you would get. So it remains to make sure that all this stuff on the first two terms is going to add up to just VC sub L. So let's see what happens. Anybody have a question? Okay. So let's just go forward here. Let's see what we got. There's a couple ways you might reason some things. Here's how I would do it. So when I multiply the first term, the taus are going to cancel. And then the E, one's positive and one's negative, so that adds up. So the very first term, the only thing that survives is V sub L. That's it. And then what's the next term? Well, the next term, the taus cancel. And you're left with e to the negative t over tau v sub L. And then, of course, this is the same. And what you'll see is that these two things are the same. So this creature and this creature add up to 0, and then it checks out. V sub L plus A over Cm, blah, blah, blah. So this is not an easy, you know, this is not an easy calculation. The first couple times you guys try to do this, don't forget, you know, even as, you know, you guys are all different levels. You know, Jingzi, you've seen a lot more classes than they say Abdullah has, at least in college level, university level mathematics and science. But this is a difficult calculation for even, you know, junior, senior level math students. It just is. And it's not because it's hard per se. It's because you're just not used to doing calculations with all these letters floating around. You're just not. So what's funny is if you read like a math neuroscience book for like the neuroscience people, they just leave out all the details of the calculation. They don't even tell you to worry about them. They just say, here's the answer. Right? But our job as the mathematicians is to understand why this is the answer. And so this is why we ask you to go through these calculations to see if you can do them. You know, the learning experience here, and I'm glad you asked this question, Abdullah, because this is the learning experience. The learning experience is you going home and trying to do the you fill in part and not being able to do it. I mean, it's like anything. Learning is such a process. I tell you guys this all the time. You're not supposed to get these things right the first couple times. If you do, great, but no one expects it. If I would have seen this calculation, you know, when I was, you know, just, you know, an undergraduate student in math, this would have scared the you-know-what out of me. It would have taken me a long time to figure this out. And the thing is you're going to make mistakes along the way, so it gets like almost discouraging. You're like, man, I can't do it. I can't do it. Oh, yeah, you can. You just have to keep pressing forward. Again, that's why when I put it in the lecture like that last time, I think this is the learning experience. You got, you know, one of the things, if you want to, you know, and some of you are going to, you know, if you take certain classes, particularly if you go engineering ways, you know, one of the things we do in applied math and engineering is we have these equations with all these parameters. So parameters is just like another name for these letters, these variables. Because when you look at this calculation, we want to think of capital T as the variable of our voltage. Remember this expression, you know, if we go to the next page and just summarize. So our voltage at any time capital T is now given by this expression, resting voltage plus this number times this integral. So the input of our function, the input of our voltage function, it actually shows up as the upper bound of an integral. And the variable of integration is lowercase t. So there's a lot happening here that's overwhelming for us as, you know, learners. Remember, you guys aren't the professionals, you're the learner. And so what we do is we call things like A and C sub M and V C sub L and tau. We call those parameters because they can change based on what kind of cell am I dealing with? What am I assuming the size is, right? So, you know, think of this as like, if you can work that calculation out on your own that we just did, I mean, that is a huge success for you guys as a learner. And you got to think of it, you know, you guys know I use these metaphors all the time. I always like to think about learning hard math in science is sort of like when you watch a kid learn how to walk. I mean, I go back to this, but think about it. It takes humans about a year to figure it out. You don't just come out when you're born and then in 3 days you're walking around. Hell, it takes you a while to figure out crawling. and then you figure out walking, but you only figure these things out by an insane amount of practice, and also an awful lot of failure. You know, you fall a lot more before you can figure out how to walk. And you first have to learn how to stand on your own without holding on to something. And so in many ways, learning stuff like what we just did is very comparable to learning some of the hardest things that your brain is going to be challenged to learn. So if you try this problem a bunch and then you finally get it, it's like a success. You got to think of that as sort of like a big goal for you, is to be able to do some of these calculations. I mean, if you think about it, it took us about 20 minutes to do that. Now, I wouldn't have gone much faster had I been doing it myself. So that just goes to show you that these things are pretty in-depth calculations. And what's nice about being able to do this is we now have a very simple description of our voltage for any current that we want to give you. And so if you think about how do you efficient now, well, doing that hard work we just did, we can now be efficient because we know this is the voltage. And so we now, heck, we could go to a computer and just write a computer's code, write a script that we can analyze this voltage for any I we give you. So if you think about it from that perspective, in problems 2 and 3, and I know we did 2 together last week, that was a very simple input. It was like a constant input for 20 seconds, I think. And we spent a lot of time suffering through that integral to get a solution. And then if you look at problem 3, the integral is an extremely difficult one that you guys actually learned in Calculus 2. It requires parts to compute. And so what you soon will realize is that for most current injections I, that integral is going to be, even if you can do it by hand, it's going to be not worth your time. And so then we start saying, hey, this is where computers are useful. All our hand calculation is going to pay off because now we've written it in terms of an integral, and now we can get great use out of this voltage equation just by programming a computer. So the hand calculation was the suffering, and then the reward is we have a very simple formula now. You might say this isn't simple, but it is. And it's very intuitive. I mean, look what happens to it. When t is 0, you get VC sub L, the resting state. What happens as t goes off to infinity? Well, it's going to depend on how our injection behaves. So if you look at problem 3, and I'm not suggesting this stuff is easy. There's a reason I didn't assign you anything else yet, because even these 3 problems are very time consuming. So time consuming that I would imagine students at your level will take much more than a week to fully be able to get these calculations down pat. But think of the intuition in these things. You know, in problem 3, I said, let's imagine our input is sinusoidal. It goes up and down. It oscillates. Well, what do we expect to happen to that integral when we integrate it? We expect to have some oscillation in return. But what happens, for example, as you let capital T get larger and larger and larger? What happens to the voltage? And so there's so much hidden in this, I mean, I call this expression simple. It's not simple. I mean, it's relatively speaking, it's simple. You know, most human beings on the planet don't understand what this thing means. Your goal, your challenge is to be able to understand this expression in the perspective of, oh, I see what happens as big T approaches 0 or as big T approaches infinity. And then can I play around with this thing for different types of functions I? Like, what if I is a polynomial? Or what if it's just t or t squared? What does this look like? So that's kind of what we want to get a feel for. Now, of course, you might say, well, what is sinusoidal? What is a realistic thing there? Well, I don't know. Maybe we're trying to mimic what a real cell goes through, that every so often it receives input from a neighboring cell. Now, we're not saying that that's the actual real world experience, but we're trying to come up with simple, again, I use the word simple in a very relative sense, but we're trying to come up with simple models that we can study from a mathematical perspective, but they also give us a good way of describing an actual experiment or actual brain activity. So that's our goal here. Does anybody have a question or a comment? I mean, this is a brutal calculation, but I think what you should really try to do is I think you should try your best to be able to write up these 3 problems on your own, even if you have to watch me do it a few times, even if you have to look at these notes a few times. You should, accept the challenge of, okay, I'm not just going to copy it down, but I'm going to be able to actually do it.
I have a quick question.
Yes,
So for the last part, can we actually do like, because you said we need to plot our solutions, right?
Well, I would like you to, right? So we did that for you on last lecture, right? We did that.
Oh yeah.
Right.
Okay.
So we did that for problem 2. And so can you find a solution for problem 3? Now, it's not necessarily easy to do. I mean, let's look at this. I'll give you some more run with it.
Okay.
I mean, we did problem 2 in its full totality. We did it. And then I went to Desmos, and I believe I showed you, we showed you, right? We graphed it. Remember the solution, and let me just pull it up to remind you. Let me share my screen here. If you look at the slides from last lecture, what we did is we got at the very end, we determined V. Now this was for the I that was a specific I. We go back, this was when I was 2 between 5 and 10, and it was 0 otherwise. So you can imagine, you think of that as, here's the current. We're going to be no current injection, and all of a sudden we're going to give it a constant injection for 20 seconds, or sorry, for what, 5 seconds? Yeah, 5 seconds, and then we cut it off again. And so what we saw a very interesting graph. We saw a graph that started at -68, and then we started injecting it, and the voltage increased, and then it died off. And let's not forget our sort of ultimate goal. And let me remind you of this. So what we know, what do you guys see right now? Do you see Google, or do you still see that other?
I'm still seeing the PDF file.
Yeah, okay, let me get this for you here. Let me get Google. All right, so remember, we're looking to try to get a function. We're trying to build the realisticness of our differential equation. So that when we plot the solution of our differential equation, it gives us this so-called action potential that we're looking for. We're looking for, if I can pull this picture up, of course it's going to have advertisements. Okay, here we go. We're looking for something. Look at the numbers here, -70 resting potential. And then we have this idea that as we start receiving current, and then all of a sudden the voltage explodes. We call that the action potential. And then it comes back down to its resting state. So we're trying to build the sophistication of our equation, our model, so that the graph of the solution resembles what we see in these experiments. Does that make sense?
Yep.
So that, and that's our job as someone who wants to model what we see. And so that's our goal. And what we found is, with the simple current injection, which we wouldn't expect to look like the real thing because it's different, right? We know in real life that a cell was receiving input from other cells, not some current injection. But what we saw, and I think I can annotate on this, I hope. What we saw was we got something like this. which clearly looks more like a shark's fin than it does that picture we just shared with you, which I don't know if you're seeing it because
Yeah, I'm seeing it.
So if you see, so what we saw was the following picture, and I just, oh yeah, you saw it. Okay, you did see it on the other page, right? Yeah. So we found, let me go back to, so you got, are you seeing this, the solution from the homework now? Okay, right. So what did the picture look like? It looked like this. It looked like, well, now it's not going to draw. Can you imagine? It probably won't let me annotate on this. We'll have to go back to our whiteboard. All right, so what we found is the following. We saw a picture that looked like this. And this looks like a shark's fin, right? This doesn't look like that action potential, but we're going to build to it, right? And this shark's fin is useful in many different scenarios. It gives us a picture that we expect, but in the scenario we're really looking for, this doesn't get the job done. So we have to do more work. Does that make sense? I don't know if it does or doesn't, but that's kind of how I want you to think about it. Okay, so what does that leave us? Well, great. Okay, so let's look at 3 now. Let's see if we can.
I have a quick question.
Yes.
So like when we're plotting the graph for question 2 or question 3, like would the CM just be 1? Because we don't.
Yeah, you know what, you could. Yeah, that's what I did for you. Yeah, that's fine. You could do it that way. You can make it simple. But did I not give you? Maybe I didn't. Did I not give you values for C sub m? I don't remember.
I don't think so.
Yeah, if I didn't, just use 1. That's fine.
Okay.
It's not going to hurt. I mean, look, those things. Again, you can really pick it to be anything you want. Well, I shouldn't say pick anything. I mean, if you want it to be a realistic model, you can't pick it to be anything you want. But for simplicity, you can use C sub m if you want. It's not going to hurt anything if you do that. Does that make sense? And usually when you're looking into, I mean, there's not many textbooks that do this kind of stuff, but I would imagine that in most textbooks, when they're giving you examples, they'll just say set C sub m equal to 1. Remember, what is C sub m? That's the membrane capacitance. So again, it's difficult to decide when you teach this stuff how much detail you want to go into everything, because if we went into detail of everything, we wouldn't get anywhere. I mean, there's a lot of the biology and the physics we're kind of just we're ignoring just so we want, because this is a math class, right? So, you know, you have to take for granted that C sub m would have these sort of values, or that V C sub L has sort of values, and what is a realistic value for tau type thing. So that's one way to think about it. Okay, so in problem 3, so we did 2 last week. In problem 3, we want I to change. So what if and I gave you the following specific case, 5 sine of 2 pi t. Okay, then let's look at what is this thing. That means we have to plug this guy in for I. And then we get one of these insane integrals, because V of t now if you want to have your nightmares of Calc 2 come back, this becomes, I'll throw the 5 out front. We'll make this a 5 because it's a constant. And then this is sine of 2 pi t dt. Well, you guys will recall this integral is a very challenging one. It requires this little sort of trick where you integrate by parts twice, and then you get an equation for the integral, and then you solve it. So this is quite a challenging integral. Luckily, people figured it out. We ask you to learn it in Calc 2. You probably forgot how to do it, and that's okay. Then you just look it up in the back of a book, and there's nothing wrong with that. So if you look it up, you get this. So when I say look it up, you can just Google table of integrals, and it's not difficult to see what happens. So let's show you what happens. In the wrong button. So what do we get? Well, so B C sub L, and then we have our plus 5 over A C sub M. Now, of course, if you want to make your life easier, I mean, you could replace C sub M with 1, but I would ask you to be a little braver and keep your parameters as parameters until you go and solve the actual solution. But that's up to you. So what do you end up getting? So if you do the integral and you plug the values in, here's what you get. This is scary looking. You get 2 pi e. And by the way, I suffered through it myself. So if you should, what you should do is you should do this on your own, but I'm not going to waste our time. Not waste. I don't want to steal the fun from you. So what you end up getting is this. So if you suffer through the calculations, what you'll get is the voltage is given by this. Now, I'm leaving these things in parentheses downstairs, just so maybe when you go look up the formula and you evaluate it at 0 to capital T, you'll see where they come from. So what's interesting is if you look at this expression, what happens when T goes to infinity? So when T goes to infinity, the numerator, there's 3 terms in the numerator. The first one goes to 0. The other 2 oscillate. Now, if you look at the denominator, you have a 2t squared, so you would say, okay, then the whole thing should go to 0.
Mm-hmm.
And so as t goes to infinity, you imagine that you get v. So here's something to think about before we go look at the graph. Does it go back to VC sub L, its resting state? Well, should it? I don't know. If we're constantly injecting it, what do we expect to happen from a realistic standpoint? Again, remember this I being defined as this sign, you would imagine this means that the current, the stimulus is not, it's only going to be 0 periodically. And then it could be positive, and then it can be negative. I mean, you can actually do even more to analyze this expression. So let's graph this. I mean, this is ugly, but Desmos should be able to graph this for us. So let me pull that up. So we'll use, and let me screen share this. Hopefully you guys are seeing Desmos. Are you seeing it?
Yeah.
Okay, this is in my way. So let's look at this. Remember, we can't use capital T's and stuff in Desmos, I don't think. We have to go back to like Y's and X's. So what is our thing? So it's negative 68. That's our VC sub L. And then it's plus 5 divided by what? AC sub N. So what did we want for A? I think we wanted, let me go back to my, so the radius is what? 10, so. So that means, what's this? This would be pi. And then 10 squared, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then we have to do this ugly thing. So it's 2 pi, not ugly, ugly in the best way imaginable. So I'm going to divide, oh boy, I didn't want that to happen. So let's put, I guess we should be very careful. We'll put a parenthesis here. So this is 2 pi, and we want it to be divided by something, which we know is, so this was really 4 pi squared because we squared it. And then the next one was what? 1 over tau. So what were we using for tau? 0.333, I think? Yeah, 3.33. Okay. So let's hope that we don't lose anything here. So this is 2 pi, and then it was e raised to the what? It's our variable over tau. So it's negative, what was our negative, our variable, negative x divided by 3.33. Yikes. And it was minus 2 pi. I guess we could have pulled these 2 pi. Oh no, because there's not a 2 pi in the third term. So what, 2 pi, and then it was cos 2 pi variable, and then plus 1 over 3.33, and then it was sine of 2 pi variable. So I think we got that in there correctly. We're going to find out when we zoom out and see what's happening down in negative land. So what do we see happening here? Well, it looks like a flat curve, does it not? So let's change our scale here. So what scale were we on these pictures before? Remember, what do we expect to happen over so many seconds? Well, suppose we go to our window and say, okay, let's change our scale here. So let's go to 10, just for example. Now let's change our y-axis. So if we go negative 69, I'm trying to find what's happening here. And once I do that, I start to see some oscillations. So if you look at this red curve, you'll notice, okay, there are some oscillations, but I'm not seeing that sort of hump that I want to see somewhere. Should I be seeing it? Should I not be seeing it? And then, of course, if you zoom out a little bit, you see the exponential portion of this really taking over. So it looks, as we expect, like we have oscillations. What happens if we change, say, this number 5? What if it's just 1 instead? Well, that flattens it out. What if it's 10? Well, okay, now we start to see something. So what if this is a little different? What if we use, say, 20 for, now you're starting to see more of what's happening, the sign. And what's interesting about this is, as you expect, the voltage is oscillating around the resting voltage.
Wait, why is it 4 pi squared in the
Oh,
denominator?
because downstairs, wasn't it 2 pi quantity squared? Do I have a typo? I might have a typo. Let me see. Oh, wrong button. Let me see if I have a typo. Now I'm losing my. So what was downstairs? Wasn't it 2 pi quantity squared? Let's go back. Yeah, so downstairs it's 2. Oh, I'm sorry. That's a typo. This should not be 2t. Oh my God, I'm an idiot. This is not 2t down here. I apologize. This is a pi. My apologies. That's a pi. Doesn't make any sense for t to be down there. It should be pi. My apologies. Now, what happens if we would change? All right, so if we go back, so just a reminder, here's some things that you might want to investigate on your own time, is remind yourselves what I was. I was just 5 sine of 2 pi t, right? So what if we change the number inside? What if we don't have the 2 pi? What if we decide then instead of that, we, let's write it in general. So what if we have some initial current that we want to sort of work with? We'll call it I sub 0. So some initial current times the sine. And then what if, instead of just being 2 pi times the variable, what if we have, we want to mess with the period a little bit? What if we want to sort of change it, make it faster or slower? So we might put some other constant like we call omega in there. And if you remember some of your trigonometry, you'll recall that this just changes the period or the frequency, however you want to think about it. And it's interesting to study what happens when omega and I sub 0 become different values. Now, the calculation I gave you is null and void. You'd have to modify it for this, but as long as you could change the 5 out front. That doesn't affect anything. So if you change this number, all that does is change this. However, if you put this omega in there, then that's going to change all these things you have over here. So, how does it change it? What does the curve look like? Does it change? I mean, you might imagine that there's higher oscillations in the beginning and it sort of dampens out. Does that happen? If so, why, when, that kind of stuff. I won't pretend that it's easy. But it's worth the challenge of trying to get through it. And of course, you don't have to just do these kind of inputs. And by the way, you already did 2 of these. I didn't tell you this, but on the very first homework, the last 2 guys you solved by hand were examples with a different stimulus. So if you look at homework 1, I'll pull this up for you just so you don't have to do it. I lost it. Where'd it go? Oh, here it is. So if you look at homework 1, and you look at problem E and F. These are different inputs. The first input here is the input TE to the negative IT. So let me explain that to you. On the homework. So on homework 1, without me telling you that's what you did. So you solved them, but you did I equals, the first one you did was TE to the negative T, and then you did E to like negative T over some number. I forget what it was. Maybe like point, I don't know. I don't remember what it was, some constant. Let's call it tau 1, and then you did some other constant. Tau 2. Now, if you look at those graphs, you might say, okay, what kind of currents are these? Well, let's go graph them. Let's think about what kind of injection this might resemble or sort of try to represent. So if I go back to sharing you the Desmos, so if we just ixnay this thing and we go back to our standard, let's graph this old friend from calculus, y equals x e to the negative x. So imagine this kind of stimulus. So ignore it. Let's ignore it for time less than 0 because you don't really consider that. Look at this stimulus. It's sort of like a linear exponential stimulus, and then it dies out. So if you look at the solution for that, what did you see? Well, you solved that in homework 1. What does the solution look like? And then we also did something like y equals e to, say, negative x over, I think I gave you like 0.03, I think. And then this was minus x to the negative x divided by 0.04. So maybe I should have those to be realistic. This would be 4. Doesn't really matter. So if we ignore this, then what kind of input is this? You might argue that's not an input. That's like a sort of, what is that? At least in the problem I gave you. But if you change those constants, those tau 1 and tau 2, you know, what happens to this? You know, just for the sake of argument, what if you put like 1, if you put like 2 here, and then 3 here? Well, look at that picture. Now, what if you switched it? What if it was 3? Oh, hold on a second. No one's yelling at me. This is not an X here. This should be an E. No wonder we're getting things that don't make sense. So let me go back. So if you go to something like this, now look at it, sort of, you imagine this is an injection of current. It starts out, it's a real high concentrated injection, and then the current dies out to 0. What does the solution look like here? Well, you solved it already, so you can actually graph it and see. Any questions about this? I think it's worth your while to really to work on these 3 problems and try to sort of study them and investigate them and see what happens. I won't pretend that it's easy. but it might be worth your while. Does anybody have a question about this? Does anybody have any other questions about the course and all that fun stuff? Remember, there's no test in here. There's just these practice sets. I think is that clear on the syllabus, or let me double check while we're all here. Yeah, so homework assignments and these projects I'm going to give you. But we'll cover that bridge soon enough. Does anybody have any questions? Comments? All right, if you guys don't have any questions, and I say, you know, go work on this, and then I'm going to post a new assignment, some stuff to get you working with Octave, you know, MATLAB type stuff, and then we're going to, the reason we have to do that is because the next, you know, if we want to get more realistic pictures, we have to study more sophisticated equations. So that's what we're going to do. Does anybody have a question?
I have a question on question 3, but can I ask you like afterwards?
Sure.
Because like I did a question, but I'm getting a different answer.
Okay, that's fine. Yeah, sure. Anything else? All right, well then look, I'm going to stop. I will stop L recording. Thank you guys for joining the party. And if you guys want to stick around and ask questions, please do. Otherwise, I will talk to you Wednesday. All right, take care. Thank you.